right, we'll get started. Okay, any questions from the lecture from last time or about anything else? Okay, so last time we were talking about social engineering. I have two more things that I'll show you regarding that, and then we'll move on to the next topic. I'm just going to close the door. So I did get a new pen, but it's extra sensitive, so hopefully this goes okay. Okay, so I'll tell you another story. This one's sort of similar to the @Matt story that we ended with last time, but it's the details are different enough that I'll show it to you. Okay, so this also is about somebody who had a Twitter handle that some hacker wanted to steal. In this case, it was @N, so it's even smaller than @Matt. And let me just write this. And this person had, there were actual offers for this. And so people offered him like $50,000 for it. So I don't know how much it's worth, but at least that's what people were bidding on him, you know, to give it to them. So it's a valuable thing. Okay, so what the adversary does is it starts basically the same way as the previous story. So first off, they go to Twitter. And they say, hi, I'm @N, and I forgot my password. Can I do a password reset? And Twitter says, no problem. Same thing that happened in the other story. We're going to send a recovery email. And so if you can click on the link in the recovery email, then you're good. Now, where this is different is, if you recall in @Matt, he had a Gmail account and then an Apple account and all of that type of stuff. In this case, @N had a unique email address at his own domain, okay, a domain that he owned. So his email was, I didn't write down the detail of what the domain is, but we'll just call it domain.com. Okay, so the adversary, they don't have the option really to connect directly to the email server. I guess maybe they could try and log in with the password or try to, you know, POP3 into it. But anyways, what they do is, first off, they do some information gathering. So they go over to whois. Whois basically a directory that gives you a lot of information about domains. Not so popular now to leave real information on Whois because it can be abused. And so most people now will use a service that will register it anonymously. So some company will fill in the details. You won't put your personal details, but it wasn't so uncommon previously that you would actually like put your real name, you put your real home address, and different things like that, that you could get that information. So in this case, they looked up domain.com, and there was no information about @n themselves, but what they did learn is who registered this domain on their behalf. And so when they saw it was with GoDaddy. Okay? Yes?
Would he know that this, like, how did he know that this is the email? Like, did he get it from the social engineering or what?
Yeah, so Twitter itself said, hey, we just sent an email addressed to your, like, so he went to Twitter and said, I want to reset my password for @n. And then Twitter displayed the email address that it sent the link to.
I guess that is the security loophole. It shouldn't display the
Yeah,
email.
absolutely. So that's another loophole. That's a good observation. I don't think that most websites do that anymore. I've noticed it's very common that they'll be like, we sent it to like p*** @gmail.com. And so, yeah, so this story is old enough that yeah. So that would be a good way to prevent these attacks as well. Okay, yeah.
So what about two-factor authentication to avoid these kind of issues?
Yeah, so two-factor authentication, remember it's for logging in to a website, right? But here we're doing a recovery. So it's a different process, and it's also a good observation that two-factor authentication can break down when people start losing things. Like they're like, oh, I lost my phone, or I lost my RSA key, or I forgot my password. You always need a recovery mechanism. And sometimes the recovery mechanism is easier to attack than the actual system itself. Because for recovery, it's usually one-factor recovery. Yeah. And so, yeah, so in this case, because it's a recovery, then it doesn't, two-factor doesn't really solve that problem.
Okay, but I was thinking, like, for example, with the email, like the root email, they started off the process as this two-factor authentication. Maybe it would be a way to somehow beat the attack mode.
Yeah, so you can, like Twitter could say, okay, you need a password. Great, you just logged in with your password. Now we send a code or like a link to your email. Click on that, then we'll log you in for real. And some of these websites do that if you want to like do serious changes. Like sometimes like just to log in and use the account, but if you want to go in and change the account settings, they might have an extra precaution like that. But anyways, if you say I want to reset my email, or sorry, I forgot my password, now they're going to send you an email, and your email is already your second factor authentication, right? So you're bypassing the password itself with access to your email account, and the second factor is access to your email account. So the recovery mechanism reduces two-factor to single factor, which is, do you have access to this email account or not? And that's generally what happens with, I know that Apple, like, I haven't like written down exactly what their procedures are, but I know that if you have a bunch of Apple devices, like if you try and reset on one, it's going to ask you on other devices. And so there is like kind of multi-factor authentication like that. But
6-digit code and the location where you're accessing the account on the Mac or on the iPhone or iPad, and it will tell you, right?
yeah, exactly that too. Yeah, if you're logging in and things like that, yeah. You have to approve it from different accounts. And so, yeah. So there might be a way to do multi-factor authentication if you're Apple and you're dealing with a user who has 4 Apple devices, right? But if you're Twitter, they have the password with you and that's all they have, right? And you have the ability to send them email and you don't have anything else. Yeah. No worries. Other comments, questions? Okay. So we go to Whois, we see that, okay, it's with GoDaddy. Okay, so now what are we going to do? We're going to go over to GoDaddy. And we're going to say, hi, I'm the owner of domain.com, and I want to reset my password because I forgot it. Okay, so the adversary actually did this over the phone. So it wasn't an automated process. And the person who answered the phone, they said, okay, you paid for this domain, so we have your payment information on hand. So that's a second factor that we could use. So why don't you give us the last 6 digits? So 6 is kind of weird. We saw 4 digits in the past one. But in this case, they wanted the last 6. Okay, and so the adversary didn't have the last 6 digits, okay? So what they did is they thought, well, who else might have those digits, or at least the last 4 digits, right? If I can log into any other of his accounts where he's registered his credit card, usually it's going to show you, it might star out like a lot of the credit card, but you could at least get those last 4 digits. So, you know, you could go to Amazon or different places like we saw in the other attack. In this case, the adversary decided to go to PayPal, which is a payments method. And once again, they did a phone call. And this is where it differs slightly. So instead of them saying, hey, I'm, this email address and I forgot my PayPal password, can you log me in? They did a different kind of social engineering attack. So they called PayPal and they said, hi, I work at PayPal. I'm just in a different division. And here's some like elaborate reason for why I can't get access to, you know, I'm missing a bunch of credit card numbers or something like that. And could you send them like they can be all starred out. Like who cares? Like, you know, just give me the information with all the credit cards starred out, you know, with the last 4 digits, right? It's not that sensitive. It's not like I can turn around and start using these credit cards because I don't know the full numbers. And so the person seemed to be more willing to release that information as a result. Now, we don't know the exact details. We don't have a transcript of the call or anything like that. But this is sort of what, so similar to the other story, the real owner ended up talking to the adversary. And so they got the details of the attack itself and wrote an article about it. So yeah, we don't have all the details, but basically they used a pretext, which is that they were a PayPal employee. From a different division of the company. And so they did elicitation. So this is the type of thing that you do after your pretext. So your pretext is what gets you close to the person that has that information. Elicitation is how you get it. And like I say, they probably use some of the techniques that we outlined before, but we don't know exactly what they did. And so they were able to get the last 4 digits of the account. Okay, so that's not quite enough, right? But we're getting close. Okay, so now the adversary goes back to GoDaddy. And this is basically what they have. So think of 6 digits, right? So they have the last 4 digits, and they don't know these 2 digits, okay? If they can get the last 6 digits, then they can reset the password for the domain. If they reset the password for the domain, then they would be able to change where the mail server is. They could point it at their own server. And if they can do that, then they can go back to Twitter and they can say, send me an email, and then it goes to their server instead of the real server, okay? So we're close, okay? So what can we do here? How can we if we only have 4 digits, but we need 6 digits, how can we get over that hump? Say louder.
Brute force it.
Sorry?
Brute force it. Like call multiple times.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so easiest option, just call 100 times, right? First time it's 0, 0. Second time it's 0, 1. Third time it's 0, 2. And 100 times isn't that crazy, right? You call 10 times a day, you're done in a week. Now you want to worry that you might get the same person, right? Or they might be logging it and they might flag it as unusual. So it's not the best option. It's not actually what they did, but it would have been a very simple option. The second option that they did is they basically use social engineering. And so once again, we don't know the exact details of what they said. But somehow they convinced the person that they were actually the right person, and they knew the last 4 digits for some reason, but they didn't know the other 2. And the other person who was on the customer service agent, they literally couldn't reset the password if they didn't know those 2 digits. Like they have to type it in the computer to issue the command. So it wasn't up to their discretion. But what they were doing is they were helping the person calling the adversary guess what they were. They're like, oh, let's try 0, 1. No, okay, let's try 0, 2. And then eventually they got the right one. So they collaborated together to hack it.
Is it, excuse me?
Yeah.
Is it like the call agent didn't also know the last two words? Like, is it like when the adversary was telling him that these are the 4 last digits and two digits I don't know. So like, shouldn't be there any mechanism to verify? Like, is he telling the right thing? Or is it like fully automated thing, like when you tell the exact combination, then it works?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't know the answer. Like the way I described it, like you have to type in the right one to do the reset. It makes it sound like it's a fully automatic one. But I don't know if they would entertain the call if they couldn't see the last 4 digits and see that they were right. So, but anyways, we don't know the exact details of the system itself.
Because if you are doing with this like hit and trial method, there could be a lot of like false attempts, and it could make your account log or something like that.
Exactly.
Servers, there are this restriction that you can make 2 or 3 false attempts.
Yeah. So there should be a lockout, like with your bank PIN or something like that, or the PIN on your phone. Lots of things lock out after 10 false attempts. And so yeah, the system would be more robust with that type of countermeasure. So that would be something that they might have learned from this incident and then implemented after. Yeah. So the pretext was that they were at end. They used persuasion because they're trying to get them to do something, which is reset the password. And so the service agent believed it. And they helped guess the 2 missing digits. Okay, so at the end of this, the reset went through, so that's great. So now the adversary goes into GoDaddy, so they log in. They go into the DNS record. They change what's called the MX server, which is the mail server, mail exchange. I'll just write email. Okay, then they go back to Twitter and reset the password, right? So not quite so fast. Okay, there's one problem here, small problem, which is once this change is made in DNS, how long does it, so Twitter has to learn that this is the new mail server, right? Because they're going to send the email to the new mail server, okay? So the change has to propagate from GoDaddy to Twitter's DNS. How long does that take? Any? Okay, it's more like days. So like, yeah, so it takes about 3 days or so. And so this, yeah, it happens in slow motion, okay? So at this point, @n starts getting, I don't know if they start getting email or something like that, like, hey, someone logged into your GoDaddy, they reset your password. Because remember, he doesn't have access, the adversary doesn't have access to the email yet, okay? So they can't delete those emails, right? So @n starts getting these emails about the fact that their GoDaddy was reset. They call GoDaddy themselves and say, I'm the real @n. I have all of this information. And they're like, yeah, we can probably get your domain back to you, but it's going to take like a week. Like we have to process it. And they're like, well, by then, you know, it's over. And so they, anyways, @n started talking to the adversary. I'm not sure how, I forget the details of how he got the contact information. But basically he could see that in 3 days he's going to lose his email address. And he knew that it wasn't just his Twitter, right? It was like all email that goes to him, like is now going to the adversary. And so it's going to affect his ability to do his job. And like, imagine if your email's about to get hijacked. You can't possibly send an email to all the people that might email you. You'd have to go change your email address on everything. It's really like a pain, right, to do. And so so then he started negotiating, and then the adversary said, oh, I want your Twitter name, right? Like that's the only reason. And then he said, okay, fine, like just take it, give me my domain back. You can have the Twitter domain, and that's how they resolved it. Actually, maybe 3 days is a little high. Maybe it is more on the order of hours. I have to remember, but I'll just put a question mark. I forget. But anyways, it takes time. It's not an instant change. And so, yeah, so then @n opens communication. With the adversary. And so adversary keeps, or they get the domain name, and @n keeps domain. And then @n is curious what the person's going to do with this domain, right? And so it turns out that they just like put some spammy like messages up and then that's it. Like, and then they don't use it for like a month or something like that. So they went through all this effort and they really didn't do anything malicious with the domain name once they got it.
Or it's just like they could have like done anything just to like defame the owner of that name.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm going to show you one other story. Yeah.
I also did something similar with the same GoDaddy. In 6.20, we had a project in which we were asked to find vulnerabilities in the forgot password mechanism. So I was analyzing multiple websites, and every website uses email or SMS services or OTPs to reset the password. But GoDaddy, they provided one more way to talk to customer care executive. for that, like you cannot give your password to a customer agent. So when you create account in GoDaddy, they give you a 4-digit PIN, which is customizable. And that 4-digit PIN is used to like authenticate yourself to the customer executive or the agent. So like if you give the correct email address and the correct 4-digit PIN, you will be authenticated to the agent and they will do whatever you ask them. So I asked my project partner to make an email address, and for the first attempt I told them to give me the 4-digit PIN.
Mm-hmm.
And I called the customer executive and I changed their email address to my email address just by using that 4-digit PIN. And in second attempt we brute forced it. Like I gave them a list of 20 PIN, 4-digit PINs which is used by people. Like 1, 2, 3, 4.
Like most common.
Most common PINs.
Yeah.
And I called like 5 to 6 times and they again changed the email address from their email to my email.
Nice.
So just a 4-digit PIN to
Yeah, okay, that's a good story. So for the recording, they probably didn't hear the story, but basically GoDaddy uses a 4-digit PIN to reset a password, one that you set. And so you were able to, with the 4-digit PIN, change the email address to your own, and then you would be able to hijack the domain.
good your password is.
Yeah. You can completely side pass the password. So like a password would have lots of entropy, and a 4-digit PIN. We actually saw in like an much earlier lecture, one of the video ones, what like the sort of heat map of 4-digit PINs look like. And there's a lot of patterns and things that people use as well. And so, if you're able to call, they don't lock down the account, then you could probably guess it in 10 or 20 attempts. Yeah, cool. Okay, one more story. And this one's actually a video again. And I scoured everywhere looking to see if I could get the sound, but I don't know how to do it. I was going to try it on the main computer, which probably is hooked up to the sound system, but then I realized the video's not on this computer and it's a big file. So we're just going to do it the same way we did last time. I'll hold my laptop up. I think there might be some subtitles or something that might help you, but anyways, okay. So if everyone can be as quiet as possible, I'm going to tilt this because the speakers are by the keyboard.
We are about to test one of Canada's largest telcos.
Hello, my name is Charles C.
These two ethical hackers, Joshua Crumba and Alex Hyde, are taking on my identity so they can take over my account.
It's a 4-digit PIN for security. Can I have it, please?
Yeah, it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
What you're watching is called social engineering.
Yeah, I wanted to add HBO to my account.
A hack that relies on charm and persuasion to get access to your information and even your money. Erin Tomlinson never thought she would be a victim. She's a former cryptocurrency exec who thought her info was secure from hackers. But that wasn't the case.
When did you know you'd been hacked? Well, I was out and my service cut out on my phone. I went to a local cafe that I always go to. One of the first things I did when I got there was check one of my financial accounts, and I saw it was at zero. That was the moment that I realized what was happening. I rushed home so that I could be at my desktop where I had the most control. And then it was a race, and it was right at the moment where they took out the last transaction that I saw it go through that I effectively blocked them.
You basically watched yourself get hacked.
Yes.
As far as she can tell, the only information the hackers had, Erin's name and phone number, and that was enough to take it all.
It was $30,000 equivalent in crypto. I was closing a mortgage weeks later, so that's what that money was for.
So how did it all unfold?
Someone or someone's contacted Rogers through chat message through their online support system.
Right.
And pretending to be me with very little information, they proceeded to ask Rogers for information about me. Each time they got one piece of information, they would say, "Thank you, I got what I needed." They would end the chat, get a new agent, and start all over again.
Erin got her hands on those chats. She couldn't believe how easily Rogers gave away all of her information.
They were given my account number, my email, my credit card information, my birth date, the amount of data on my account, my last bill amount.
It takes 8 different chats, but eventually the hackers convince the employee to deactivate Erin's SIM card and then activate a new one. It's called a SIM swap, and it can give hackers access to all of your apps and financial accounts.
Yeah, I don't know how to describe it. I was sort of in shock at the whole thing.
Erin's case might sound extreme, but she's not alone. In 2017, TELUS gave out one customer's personal information to her stalker, putting her info and her security at risk. Just 3 months ago, the government ordered all companies to report all hacks to Canada's Privacy Commissioner. Since then, there have been over a dozen cases involving social engineering in the telco sector alone. And companies around the world admit social engineering attacks are on the rise.
We're in New York City, about to meet with some cybersecurity pros who are going to tell us and show us how hacking can hurt us all and what we can do to stop them.
One of my email accounts has been compromised. And this is what the bad guys do. They actually spend time trying to force errors.
This is Info Security North America. Dozens of experts, hundreds of enthusiasts finding flaws in security systems and showcasing solutions all in one place.
From videos that teach you how to avoid getting hacked,
the biggest threat to an organization is your users. We call it the human firewall. Instead of a user blindly clicking on links or opening attachments, we want to train that user to take a moment, think about what they're going to do, and then actually make a decision, an informed decision.
to interactive games like squashing bad computer bots.
So we are differentiating bad bots from humans, and so as you play, you'll see bots light up in random locations, and you have to smash the bots.
This is so hard.
It's pretty hard, right?
Top 3.
There's even a security-themed escape room.
Okay, an escape room? What does this have to do with social engineering?
So we do immersive security awareness training. So the first codes for the rotors is B124. So in this room, there's a bunch of puzzles that have to do with helping people understand what social engineering is and how they can better protect themselves.
These guys are at the conference too. They're ethical hackers ready to use their skills on my cable provider, Rogers.
It's just psychology. So if you understand how somebody's going to react to something, you can easily manipulate somebody into giving them information or access to things that maybe they shouldn't.
Okay, let's give it a go,
so
guys.
I guess I'm going to call this number. It will look as if I'm calling from you, and I am Matthew, your personal assistant.
Will the rep fall for it?
Hi, this is from Rogers in Toronto. May I have your first and last name?
Well, my name is Matthew. I'm actually, I'm calling on behalf of my boss. I'm her personal assistant. Her name, though, is Chelsea Agro. So basically, she's asked me to call and get HBO added and also just verify a couple things about her account.
Yes, she need to be contact us. It's based on the personal information in order to put you on the contact us.
Okay.
First call, and this employee is not buying it.
If at first you don't succeed, just hack again.
Think of how many people work there, though. You only need one out of a group.
So Joshua tests a new Rogers rep.
Hello, Rogers in Ontario. Can you click a different element, please?
The same old trick with a twist. This time, he's impersonating me.
My name is Chelsea
Chelsea, your last name?
Agro.
Perfect. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
How can I help you?
Yeah, I wanted to add HBO to my account.
It's a 4-digit PIN for security. Can I have it, please?
Yeah, it's 1, 2, 3, 4.
It's not a valid PIN.
It's normally the one I use. Let's try 0246. That's the other one.
Wrong pin, but the rep doesn't flag it. Strike one.
246. No, I thought there was a security question, but there is none of it. Chelsea, can I get your postal code, please, and date of birth?
Date of birth is...
After a quick search online, they do find a postal code.
Okay, yeah, there we are. It's...
They're off by a digit, but the Rogers rep doesn't catch that mistake either. Strike two.
Perfect. And the last question, the email, please.
It should be at Gmail.
Perfect. Okay.
And this is where it gets scary.
Oh, could we set a passcode as long as we're in here?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Just give me a moment, okay? Do you have a 4-digit PIN in mind?
Yeah. Let's make it 0246. You want to change that right away afterwards.
Hard to believe he actually changes the passcode on my account. A serious strike number 3. And the game's not over yet. He even adds his own security question.
And I need you to select a security question.
We'll go with name of the first pet.
First pet, and the answer would be?
It was Rufus. R-U-F-U-S.
And just when you think it can't get any worse, he adds himself to my account.
All right, and while I'm at it, could I add my personal assistant as a level 1 user?
Absolutely, yes. Let me see. And what's his or her name?
His name is Joshua.
Okay. Joshua.
Last name Crumbaugh. C-R-U-M-B-A-U-G-H.
The rep on the phone even starts volunteering information, including the other name on my account.
Joshua Crumbaugh, got it. Okay. I have an authorized user here.
Yeah, that's her. That's my husband.
And just like that, the damage is done.
Okay, thank you for choosing Deutsche. Have a nice day.
So I'm shocked because you actually got my postal code wrong. It was off by a digit, and they still let you do that.
So again, it's all about the profile of the person who picks up.
I think the biggest thing is education. We have got to do more in making our people aware that these things happen.
This is your marketplace. It's the latest con game.
Everyone's always going to get hacked. It's just a matter of when that happens, not if that happens.
Could we set a passcode as long as we're in here?
Yes, yeah.
We're revealing how hackers can use their skills to con companies into giving it all away. At this security conference in New York, the ultimate headliner is one of the world's most famous hackers, Kevin Mitnick.
I was on a trophy hunt to see how many companies I could hack into.
Once a con man and one of the FBI's most wanted, he hacked into 40 companies, even went to prison for 5 years.
Not for their information, per se. It was the challenge of getting through their security. So for me, it was all about the pursuit of knowledge and the seduction of adventure. It was never about causing any harm, never about making any money.
Now he's flipped, using his hacker skills to train companies on how to protect you from people like him.
What is it about human nature and the goals of customer service that make people, organizations vulnerable when it comes to social engineering?
Well, customer service, it's all about customers the king, and customer service is going to bend over backwards to make the customer happy.
Mitnick says part of the problem is those security questions many companies use to verify you.
The companies need to have policies put into place to come up with a way to have a very high confidence that they're dealing with the consumer. They're the ones that are in control, because they're the ones that could affect change. The consumer can't. The consumer can only demand change, and if they're unwilling to do it, you go to a different vendor.
social engineering victim Erin Tomlinson agrees. She says Rogers should have done more to protect her info.
What did they offer you?
They offered me 3 months free service.
Sorry, 3 months of free service.
Yeah, and
After losing
$30,000. And then they, obviously I said, I don't think that's appropriate. They came back to me again and said, okay, you're right. We're gonna offer you 1 year of free service. To which I said, I feel like that is a joke at my expense.
Erin's not giving up. She's now suing Rogers.
What I really want to see is not just that they give platitudes and say, oh, we're sorry this happened, from a customer service point of view, but that they make real changes to their policies and their training internally so that this can't happen.
Rogers declined to speak to us about Erin's case as it's before the courts, but they argue they're not responsible for what happened to her. They do say they provide ongoing training for their staff and that they take customers' privacy and security very seriously. They also say they're constantly updating and improving their security measures and their verification processes. Rogers does admit, though, that those steps were not followed properly by the customer service rep when my account was hacked. Do you think that your members right now are doing a good job protecting customers' privacy?
I think they are.
Meet Robert Gibbs. He's the head of the Canadian Wireless Telecommunications Association, an industry group representing some of the big telcos.
I think that they are putting mechanisms in place, that they are training and educating, but the difficulty is staying ahead of the fraudsters.
I know they're good. You know how I know they're good? We had 2 ethical hackers. They teamed out. They got into my Rogers account. They had the wrong PIN number. They had my wrong postal code, and they still got in. So that's troubling for me as a consumer, but I want to know how troubling that is for you.
Yeah, well, obviously protecting the security of my members' customers is something that's vitally important to them. And that's why they will continue to educate, they will continue to train, but there's always going to be human error, there's always going to be fraudsters out there, and it's up to all industries to ensure that they do the best to protect individual security with a constantly evolving technology that's only going to grow into the future.
Experts have been really clear with us that companies need to move away from the personal information as a way to authenticate or validate a user. When are you going to step up and tell companies, let's make a change, this isn't working?
Yeah, well, that's only one portion of what they do. So whether or not it's asking what your birth date is or what your address is, that's why they're adding in now PINs, passwords, security questions.
So even though they have these measures in place, it doesn't seem to matter. They're not working. They got in anyway.
Well, they are working. The thing is, there's millions of calls.
Didn't work for me.
There's millions of calls that will come in every week, and there's always going to be some human error that's going to exist. But you're right. It's got to be about educating those frontline services. Yeah. It's got to be about training those frontline services, and that needs to continue and needs to be more vigilant into the future.
Ethical hackers Joshua and Alex agree. Companies shouldn't be asking for personal information to verify us. But they also say we shouldn't make it too easy for hackers by sharing too much ourselves.
So many people will use their children's names or birth dates or their animals' names as passwords. And then you go onto their social media and they've posted 1 million pictures of the same dog with the name of the dog, and they're basically putting their passwords out there for everyone to see.
Is he right? Do we really share too much? We're taking that question to the streets.
What kind of password do you have? Like a dog's name, a birth date?
I do use my dog's name.
Oh, what kind of dog do you have?
I have a Shih Tzu.
Oh, what's his name? What security question would you choose?
My mother's name.
What's your mom's name?
Can I reveal that? No. Okay, my mom's name is...
So, like, your security answer would for your bank?
Yes.
How strong do you think your online password is?
Very, very strong. It's a name that nobody will be able to guess.
So, like, your partner's name?
Yeah, something like that.
What's your partner's name?
I can't say.
Why?
Yeah.
So your password plus a bunch of numbers?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you. Please go change your password.
Have a good one, guys. Take care.
I've changed my password, and now it's up to companies to change their practices.
All right. Okay, so that's a good illustration of, when in the other stories we said, oh, you talk to a human customer service agent, and so that's sort of what the experience could be like.
So, Professor,
yeah.
Is it like anything we put online is not safe? Anything. It's just like until the time thing is in your hand, or what is security? Like, it's just like best common practices or what?
Yeah, so it actually goes back to the very first lecture where I tried to say that security is, you can never prove that something's secure, right? It's almost like you have a list of things that you don't do, right? Like, oh, I'm not vulnerable to this, I'm not vulnerable to this. And at the end of the day, that's really all you can say. So you can't actually make a positive statement like, oh, this is secure. So in social engineering, these stories happen, and now you know that they're going to go, like Rogers will go and change, especially if it's on like CBC, right? And so that attack will never happen again because they'll do whatever. They'll put some measures in place in order to make sure it. But then people will think up another attack, right? And it will just go back and forth. And that's the game of security. It's a sort of cat and mouse game that goes.
I've seen many attacks, and majority of most of them are because of human error.
Yeah.
Just like all of the I've seen so many attacks, and they're just because of human error. And then at the end of the day, we are training our employees.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what I want to emphasize in this, at least this section of the course, as well as it's a theme that goes throughout the course as well, is that, yeah, humans, they're important to the security, right? And if your procedures aren't right at the human level, then it doesn't matter. You can have the best RSA, like two-factor authentication token in your pocket, or you can have the best, most secure encrypted email, whatever. You have all these tools, technical tools, right? But humans have to use them. Humans are involved in resetting or identity management, issuing certificates, right? And so, yeah.
Weakest or strongest link in any security is you are. Like even in securities, you are.
Yeah.
So you are the most weakest or strongest link.
Yeah. And so that's actually a point that I want to make that maybe I'll write down. So I'll just, let me do a recap. So we have this concept in security of the weakest link, right? And so a security system might, have a lot of different things that are protecting it, and the adversary, they're going to go after the weakest link, right? And if they can break through that weakest link, right, then it doesn't matter. Oh, it does sort of matter the other protections you have because you're at least driving them towards that weakest link. So it's not like they're doing anything, but they're not successfully securing your system. So in this case, for example, like the person said, how many people work at Rogers in their customer service agent, right? Hundreds, right? So the weakest link is the one person that's going to let you into the account, even though the pin's wrong and the postal code's wrong and all of that type of stuff, right? So it just takes one, right? You find that one person and then you're in. It's hard to protect against. I mean, if you're Rogers and you're trying to, because people do legitimately want to change their accounts, right? And people forget, like, what was the verification question I used? I don't know. Like, I don't remember what it is for my phone provider. I try not to use actual real ones, right? Because they're too easy to look up. So I usually make stuff up. And I don't remember it. Like, how could I even prove my identity? And so the ability to distinguish a real user who's forgetful, who doesn't remember everything, from an adversary that's impersonating the user and putting a lot of effort into that impersonation, that's a really hard problem for a company to try and tell the difference between those two individuals, right? But that's their job. They have to do it, right? Or at least they can minimize the damage that can be done when mistakes are made. So a recurring theme is, as was mentioned, education and training. So that's a response that you often hear. Everyone's doing it. But, you know, is there actually something better that you can do? I don't know. Like, you know, there isn't like it's not like math where you can be like, okay, here's a procedure that you should follow and we can prove that like you cannot like break this from a social engineering perspective. There's nothing like that for social engineering, right? So it's all based on, and we'll talk about procedures later as well. Another response that you can do, let me shift this a bit. Is you can try and like do damage limitation. So like assume that someone's going to get in and then try and limit the damage somehow. One way you can do it is you can try and distribute access control over like many people so that you have to compromise more than one person. And this is going back to the generic idea of social engineering, not the specific Rogers case, but like think of a company and you want access to the server room or something like that. You can hire like the two people that were in the video or Kevin Mitnick, if you can afford him. And then from more of a technical standpoint, there's a few technologies or things that we keep seeing over and over. So you might want to reconsider your reliance on, so things like DNS, phone, SMS. We didn't really see these, but this was involved in the SIM card hack. They didn't go into the details of what you could do with that. They just sort of stated the end case. Email addresses are used a lot. In-person actions, customer support, that type of thing. Okay, so I wish I had a cleaner story to tell about social engineering. I don't, but at least now hopefully you understand it. You understand the mechanics of how it works. You can think about the attacks. You can break them down into pretexts, elicitation, information gathering, persuasion, and you've seen some stories about how they actually work. Is there any final questions or comments before we move to the next topic? Yeah. So I don't know. Like I'm just pulling these out as sort of the common things that seem to go wrong, but I don't have good solutions for like other things that you could rely on. All of these things kind of reduce to passwords. Either to like all of these things, you can get access with a password, or you can reset it through convincing someone that you are, you know, who you're pretending to be. And so you know, I don't know, maybe at the end of the day, it's just like passwords are like the solution, because it's the you know, they're not perfect, but there is no other better alternative. And you think you're clever because you're doing email resets or other things, but like there's just a password protecting that anyways, right? And so maybe we need to invest more energy into, you know, using password managers and choosing random passwords and unique passwords for every site, using software to manage that for us, sync it across our devices and things like that. Maybe that's a better approach. And then people are going to not lose their passwords, hopefully, as frequently. There'd be less resets. Maybe customer support would be more suspicious of those cases because it would happen less. I don't know. Yeah, so I don't have a great answer to that. But yeah, it seems that, you know, as bad as passwords are, they seem to be the one sort of common denominator under everything. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done. Actually, I think we're there now. Like, I'm very happy with Apple's, for example, password manager. It's great. It recognizes password fields. It gives me a strong random password, at least I assume it is. It stores it. Yes, there's one master password, my iCloud password, that, you know, is protecting all of my passwords, right? And so that's somewhat problematic. And if I really care about the website, I'll make my own password up and not store it. You know, and then you have to look at how does Apple allow resets and things like that, but they seem to do a pretty good job. And so that's like something, it's definitely better than it was 10 years ago. We had password managers like LastPass, but they were like plugins and you had to copy and paste stuff and they were awkward. And there were some issues where it went down and then all of a sudden you're locked out of all your accounts and things like that. And so, yeah. Other questions or comments? Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back at 7 and we'll talk about usability. All right, we'll start again. Okay, so the next topic that we'll talk about that's sort of related to social engineering in the sense that it involves humans, but it's from a different perspective, is usability and security. Okay, so usability is something we saw earlier when we did our evaluation frameworks. We saw usability along with security and deployability as one of the things that we look for in a security system. And so the motivation for considering usability is assume that, for example, you have a system like some sort of security solution, and it's really good at a technical level. Okay, so it provides very strong security, but it's not usable. Okay, so humans have a hard time using it. They make mistakes using it. So what are some of the things that would go wrong in that scenario? Yeah, if you know, shout it out.
That the user won't do the security checks because it's so hard to use.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so they would use it wrong because it's hard to use. I won't say because it's hard. So they'll use it wrong. They might make errors, frequent errors. Users might just avoid using it, right? They don't want to use it, and so they use the old way, even though there's some new way that's more secure. So they do something insecure instead to circumvent it. Another theme that we'll see is that security is a secondary goal. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you use a system, you want to use it to do whatever it is that you want to do, right? If you can do it in a secure way, that's better than in an insecure way. But you don't sit down to do security, right? You sit down to send an email, and if you can do that in a secure way, then that's okay. So security is always the second consideration, but your first consideration is let's actually do the thing that we're trying to do. Another thing that we see as well, that we saw it already with SSL, is that users habituate to error messages and warnings and things like that. So the first time they see it, they might take it seriously. The 10th time they see it or the 100th time they see it, then it could become to the point where they're just sort of swatting it away, trying to make it go away, and just so that they can concentrate on the primary task itself. So using dialogues, using warnings and things like that, it doesn't always work in the long run. It might work in the short run, but users will get fatigued, they'll get tired of it, and yeah. So habituate just means that you get so used to it that you don't pay attention anymore, or fatigued, meaning you get tired of it. And so, like I remember when firewalls first came out as a personal software thing that you would install on your computer. People don't use them that way anymore. But like every single website it would connect to, it would ask you, oh, are you sure you want to connect to this? Right? And you'd load one website, but it would load stuff from 10 different domains. So you get 10 messages just by going to one website. And, you know, at first you're like, you pay a lot of attention and you're like, okay, I'll allow that. I won't allow that. And then eventually you just give up because it's too much information. Some other points that just to introduce the concept. Okay, so one thing that we see is that defaults matter a lot. So defaults are, you might say, well, you know, users are different. You know, some users are like pros at security and some are novices. And so we'll give them the option to configure the security the way they want, right? But if you do that, so that's a great idea, but you have to start with a default, right? So when you give the user the software for the first place, you have to decide what that, at least that first setting is before the user goes in and tweaks it, okay? What you choose as the default, most users will not change, okay? They'll keep the default. So an example of this that has nothing to do with security that was in a book called Nudge that was looking at like public policy and how defaults matter in public policy. And I forget the exact number, so I'm going to make it up. But basically the researchers, they went and it was in the US. And so they looked at different states and they said, what's the rate that people agree to donate their organs if they, say, got in a car accident or something like that and they died? And what they found is that you had some states, it was really high, like 90%, and some states were really low, like 10%. And they said, oh, that's interesting, like what's the difference? And so the difference was the default, right? So in states, some states you would get your driver's license, and they'd say, okay, you're an organ donor, it's fine, you can choose, that's your choice, right? You can choose whether you want to be or not. If you don't want to be, here's an extra form, fill it out, and then you don't have to be an organ donor. So in states like that, almost everyone agreed to it, right? Because they didn't want to fill out the extra paperwork, right? And then in other states, it was the exact opposite. It's like, oh, you want to donate your organs? That's fine. There's an extra form. You can fill it out in order to be an organ donor. And in that state, almost nobody did it, right? And so both of them, they gave the option. The only difference between them is the defaults. And so the point of the book is that you should consider, you can change people's behaviors but without limiting their freedom of choice just by changing defaults. And so it applies to security as well. So whenever you get software, there's lots of security settings. It comes with a set of defaults. Most people aren't going to go in and touch those defaults. Another sort of high-level principle from the security usability literature is that security works the best if the software just does it for you, okay? So there was like a movement to like try and get the user more active in making decisions, but most users didn't know, they didn't care, or they didn't understand. And so the thinking now is that like just do the security in the background, don't ask the user, try and involve the user as little as possible, okay? Just try and make decisions on their behalf. You can always have settings like to tweak it, but at least the default settings should be, try and do as much of it as you can without involving the user. Only involve the user if it's absolutely essential. So most of what I say is actually, I'm sort of thinking about software implicitly, but the principles extend beyond software, but I'll talk a lot about software as at least the running example. Okay, there used to be, back when I was young, you would get a piece of software, like say Microsoft Office, right? And it would come with a user manual that was like 200 pages long. And the expectation is, you install it, it's on CDs, and then you read the manual, or at least you look up, like, how do I do something while, I'll RTFM, I'll read the manual to figure out what I'm supposed to do, okay? And so that thinking is now kind of obsolete. What we expect from our software is that the software will actually guide us, right? So if I have something that I want to do, I'll go look in the menus or I'll look at the user interface, and it should be intuitive how I accomplish that attack or that task. And so the software should guide you, and it should also provide feedback, right? So like, what's the current status of the software? Is it I think it's doing something. Is it actually doing what I think it's doing? And so I should be able to see that. So we'll see an example. I'm going to do I'll do a live demo where we'll look at the usability of Tor, which is a browser that you can use to anonymously browse the internet. And so you'll see like these principles at play there. The software is intuitive. It should be clear what you need to do. Like you have a goal in your mind. I want to get to a website and be anonymous, right? I should be able to just sort of follow along and be able to accomplish that goal. And the feedback would be like, okay, am I now anonymous or not, right? And so that should be obvious to me, and I should know my status at all times. Another common thing is that developers aren't users. And so a lot of people who develop software, they'll do usability testing or they'll try and think about what the usability is like. They'll get the developers who wrote the software to do it. Of course, to them, everything makes perfect sense, right? Because they have the complete picture in their mind. And it's really hard to like kind of forget everything you know and put yourselves in the shoes of a user who doesn't know anything at all, right, about your software, and then try and see it from their perspective. Now, there is a technique that will show where you try and do exactly that, but we expect that you would have some training in your ability to do that, to put yourself in the shoes of someone that has never used the software before. It's something that you will all do in assignment 2 as well. Okay, so you're all going to do that particular task. Okay, so let's say that you have some software, or it could be something that's not software, but we'll use software as the example, and you want to know whether it's usable or not. What's the methodology that you use for testing it? And so it turns out that there's 3 methodologies that are relatively common. So we'll talk about all 3 of them. These aren't specific to security, so it would be the same thing if you just wanted to test other aspects of the software. But where security comes in, it's more in the questions that you're asking. So you're asking questions about security as you go through these methodologies. But these methodologies are more general. So they fall into a class of HCI, human-computer interaction, which is the sort of broader field of usability. But there's a sub-community that takes these methodologies and applies it to questions of security tools and analyzing it. Okay, so the easiest that you can do, the quickest and easiest is do an expert review. Generally, you would do this with 1 or more what we call dual experts. So basically, you're just going to hire someone, or you have someone on your team, and they're just going to do the usability study. And there's a certain methodology that they'll follow, and we'll talk about it. There's different ones, but we'll talk about one called a cognitive walkthrough. And the person you're looking for is, they should know something about usability. Okay, so they should know what the methodology is and how it works. And then they should also know the system that they're evaluating. So they should know how it does actually work, so that they can try and find the gaps between them. So we call them dual experts because they're an expert in both usability and in security, if you're looking at security, for example. So security, or more generally, the underlying system, how the underlying system works. System being tested works. Okay, the second thing you can do is you can pull people off the street, usually pay them, bring them in a lab, sit them down and have them use the software, and then you'd measure, basically how they use it. So this is called a user study. And so you're doing this with the general population. And then the third option, which is the best, but it's also the hardest to arrange, is what we call a field study. And so a field study is where you push it to your actual users themselves, sometimes in a controlled experiment. So you might have an idea of, for example, a new security mechanism. And so you might take your actual users, like the employees of your company, give half of them the new system and have the other half use the old system, and then you try and measure the differences between them and how much it changes the security behavior and what usability issues it causes. Okay, so we're going to go through the 3 of them. I'm actually going to do it out of order. I'm going to start with user studies first, then we'll talk about expert review, and then we'll talk about field study. All right, so I'll think of the pros and cons of using a user study as opposed to the other methodologies, which we haven't seen yet, but I'll sort of go through it. Okay, so the pro of a user study is you're going to pull in somebody like a normal person. Okay, so you're not going to get an expert, you're not going to get a developer or something like that, and so your chances of finding a usability issue is higher based on the population that you're using. Now, there's a series of drawbacks with a user study, especially relative to the other kinds of things that you might be able to do. So the first thing is it's expensive and it's time consuming. So if you think about, you're going to bring a user in, maybe you sit them down for half an hour or you sit them down for 1 hour, that's fine. But in order to learn enough about the system, you're going to have to do it with 20 users or 100 users, right? So 100 users, that's 100 hours. Right, so someone has to do the 100 hours, and it's not just the 100 hours of sitting in the room. You know, you have to recruit the users, you have to schedule them. People will call and be like, "Oh, I can't make it," or they'll be late, and then it throws the whole schedule off and things like that. Okay, so it's a whole production to manage and run a user study. It's not as easy as it sounds, like just from a logistical standpoint. You usually pay people to do it. Sometimes people get paid kind of probabilistically, like they'll be like, we'll put your name in a draw for like a new iPad or something like that. But it's more common that you would just get paid. And it's important that you get paid regardless of whether you complete the study or not, so that the money doesn't influence the study. So once you agree and you've been screened, then you get paid, and it doesn't matter. You can walk away at any time, and you get to keep your payment. Now, a field study is arguably more expensive, so maybe I'll say it's moderately expensive. So expensive sort of relative to something else. So it's more expensive than just having one of your people go through it once, but it's not as expensive as doing a field study, which we'll talk about in a bit. Okay, then there's some problems with the actual data itself that you get. So the first question you have to ask yourself is related to what we call representativeness. And that's basically, you're pulling normal people off the street, that's fine. But you also have in your mind like the people who are going to use your software, okay? How close are normal people to the people that will use your software? So it's going to depend on the software itself, right? Like maybe it's some social networking and the people that you pull into your user study are exactly the people that will use it, right? Maybe it's some IT software, and so the people that you pull in to your user study are different from the actual people that would use it, okay? So that's a question of how representative it is. When you do a user study, especially in a university setting, you get a lot of students, for example, okay? So students have a certain demographic, right? Not everyone's the same, but in terms of age, you know, everyone here is probably of a fairly similar age. In terms of you're sitting in a computer science, information systems engineering class, and so how well can you use technology, right? Think of all the people in your life, you know, there's people that don't use it as much as you, and there's probably people that use it more than you, but you are on the upper end of, you know, how sort of sophisticated you are with technology, for example. Right? So there's certain demographic properties where you're going to differ from the general population, and you therefore might differ from the actual target for the software that you're developing and testing the usability of. So how close are they to your the real users in terms of knowledge and experience, primarily? Another problem with your data is if you bring a user in and you sit them down and say it's some like security test, I don't know, like you're gonna get them to set up a password or something and see if they remember it and whatever. They're coming into a lab, they're sitting, you're standing with your clipboard watching them. Are they going to behave, like are they going to choose a password that's the same as they would choose at home? Not necessarily, okay? The lab environment kind of amplifies them. They're thinking more about what they're doing. They're thinking about what the study's about. If they get a whiff that it's about security, then they want to put their best foot forward. They want to impress you. And so the decisions they make may not be consistent with what they would make if they weren't in that lab setting. So we call this ecological validity. So does the lab environment cause different decisions? Or behaviors? Okay, the final thing is you get a user. As I said, it's time consuming. So, you know, if you're bringing a user in for half an hour or an hour, you know, you want to run it with lots of users, and so it's time consuming. The question is, how much can you actually have a user do in half an hour? Okay, if you're going to be measuring everything you do and you're going to be explaining it and things like that, they can't do a lot, right? And so what you're going to end up with a user study is a pretty narrow task that you can ask a user to do, okay? That you're not going to test everything, every feature or capability of software with a user, right? You're only going to be able to do a limited amount, you know, something that they could do in half an hour or an hour. They're going to get fatigued after an hour, so you can't keep them longer than that. So the window of what you can measure is narrow. Sorry, yeah, exactly, yeah. So you can you can have them do different things, right? But anyways, whatever it is, you have to assume like how long would it take an expert to do it, but then you have to multiply it by 3 or 5, right? Because A, they've never done it before, right? So they're going to be slower at it, and secondly, you're measuring and you're telling them what to do, and there's a sort of instrumentation to what you're doing, and that adds like time as well. So you put all those things together, and yeah, a normal task that takes 5 minutes all of a sudden takes half an hour in that setting. Okay, so what does a user study look like? Say for your final project, you think this is really cool, you want to do a user study now.
Is there any one pro for this?
Is there any one which? Sorry?
One benefit of this, the user, one like where the pros and cons?
Yeah. So basically, I'm concentrating more, I guess, on the cons, not because I'm trying to tell you it's a bad method, but that's sort of where the comparison to the other three, all three of them are useful because all three of them get you what you want, which is a measure of usability. So that's the big pro of all three methods. And yeah, the reason I have cons is just because they're cons relative to the other kinds of ones that you want. Okay, so you want to do your user study for your final project. That's great. Sorry, it's too late. Okay, you're not going to be able to do it because the very first step you would have to do if you're going to do it in a university environment is you have to go to what's called the ethics board and get it cleared. And that takes time. Okay, so any study that involves human subjects, the university has to sign off on it. Even if you're just asking them questions or having them, I don't know, use email or something like that, that just means that they're more likely to approve it, but it doesn't mean that you can skip that step because there's no obvious ethical issues with it. But with security research, there is ethical issues that sometimes come into play, right? So you have to think about even the data that you're collecting from a security perspective. How are you going to store it? You know, who has access to the data? Which of your students or people in your lab have access to the data? How long are you keeping it? Are you going to get rid of it at some point? So any personal data that you collect, and you have to collect it in order to understand the demographics of your user, there's an immediate security question or privacy question around that. And then in terms of the task itself, there's things like you can't go, like you saw in the CBC, they were asking people their passwords. You can't do that in a user study, okay? Because you can't take custody of people's real passwords. And you know, what if like one of your lab mates went rogue and started logging in as people and things like that? It would be a disaster, right? So you would never get that past ethics. There's other things too, like you might say you're doing some network measurements, right? So let's say I install something on your phone because I want to see how your phone behaves relative to other people's phones, you know, based on operating system or location in the world or something like that. So I try to load a bunch of websites, maybe politically sensitive websites, because I'm interested in whether the country that have your phone in is censoring the internet for you, right? Well, I am actually sending you, I'm making it look like your phone is asking for politically sensitive information, right? And that's something that could be monitored by a government, right? And that's something that could land you in trouble as a person, right? And so even though it's a user study, it's just automated, the user doesn't know that, and so there's an ethical question. So maybe it's you get the consent of the user, right? So you make them really understand informed consent, right? Or maybe it's just like, don't do it because it's the risk outweigh the benefits, or find a different way to get that information without risking your users. Okay, so these are the kinds of questions that ethics review boards will review. It's something that the very last lecture of this class, if we have time, we'll do a lecture on ethics as well. But anyway, okay, so this applies to any study with human participants. So handling personal data is just one example of where they might have a say. Another thing that's often used in user studies is if you come in and you're like, hey, I'm doing a study on security, then the user is automatically going to behave more secure, as we said, right? And so usually you want to deceive the user. So you want to use deception, and you want to say, oh, the user study is about this, when really it's about this other thing. Okay, and so deception is another thing that you're allowed to do. That's fine, but the ethics rules are going to say, you know, things like, well, you have to tell them at the end that, oh, by the way, it was all like a facade, and really this study was about this. And there's different rules about using deception. So other issues will depend on the nature of your study. Ethics clearances, you know, at a big university, it's like there's lots of, it's not just computer scientists that are doing it, right? People in psych, and if you have a medical school and things like that, the number of like proposals that go through this committee is a lot. And so you can expect that it's going to take a month or two in order to get your clearance. So that's one thing. The second thing is that this is really, like, I'm biased because I'm an academic, so I'm telling you the academic perspective. Let's say you work at Facebook, you still might do usability studies on security or privacy, but there it's not an academic institution. Do they have ethics clearance? Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, right? So most corporations wouldn't. And Facebook, you know, probably needed it for some of the studies they've done in the past. You know, things have changed in response. You know, when companies get sort of publicly burned for doing unethical things, then they might institute, ethics boards within their organizations and things like that. But anyways, whether you need ethics clearance depends on your situation. So academics definitely need it, and not all universities either around the world necessarily have an ethics board either. So anyways, this is the first step. The first step is just check and make sure that if you need ethics clearance that you obtain it. Okay, so now we got our ethics clearance, so that's great. Now we need users. Okay, so we have to recruit users. Now, how you advertise is going to have an impact on who you attract. Okay, and it's going to ultimately affect your demographics, and that can affect the representativeness of your sample, right? So if I put posters up around the university, I'll get lots of grad students or undergrad students, right? And so that's a certain demographic, right? If I put them up at a grocery store, I'm going to get a different demographic, right? If I even just use posters, right, that's going to be a different demographic than maybe posts on Facebook or targeted emails or whatever. Okay, so the method that you use, where you post it, who you're distributing this knowledge to, that's going to have some influence on who you attract, and that's going to affect your representativeness. So how you advertise will impact who your participants are. Okay, another thing is, do you have to get real users and bring them physically into a room? And the answer is no. So there are lots of studies where you can do it, like say they're using a website or something like that. It doesn't matter, they don't have to be here. Okay, so you can recruit them online. There's a bunch of online services that offer things like Mechanical Turk, Mturk it's called now, Cloudflower, where you can pay people for small tasks, small amounts. So you pay them $10 to do something that takes 20 minutes or things like that. And so you can use those types of web studies. They're still a user study, and it's easy in that case to get 10,000 users, right? But you have to fully automate your tests, right? So it needs to be, you're not, you could, I guess, do it where they're interacting with you, but it's easier if you can fully automate it, then they can just do it, and lots of people can do it in parallel, right? And so you can get good results that way. But you're limited into things that could be done in that setting. So not all things that you might want to measure could be done in that setting. And another perk of this is that there was some research, like researchers said, oh, people are using Mturk a lot. Maybe we should figure out what the demographics of Mturk users are. Because if we just do that once, then it's going to apply to all of the studies. So we can go and we can figure out, age, technical experience, like whatever is relevant. And so there are some good studies of that. And so we know the demographics of these users fairly well. Okay, the next thing you do is you recruit a bunch of users, so that's fine. So now you have a list of 500 people that want to do your user study. Usually what you will do is you won't select all of them. Okay, so you're going to select some of them. And the reason you select them is it goes back again to that representativeness, right? You want a good mix that matches your target user as much as possible. And so usually what you'll do is you'll break your study into 2 phases. The first phase is you'll give a whole bunch of people just a questionnaire. They might get paid a little bit to fill it out. Then you'll learn what their demographics are and other things about them. And then based on the questionnaire, you're going to choose a smaller subset to actually bring in to the lab to do the study. So you do a pre-study questionnaire. So you try and match it for representativeness. You can screen participants, drop them for whatever reason. If there's some traits or something that you notice that you don't like, you can do it. Now let's say that you do this, so that's great, but you still can't get representativeness, right? You don't have enough, whatever, person of type X in your study, right? What you can do is you can try and use statistics to compensate for that, okay? So you might say, oh, this user, they're sort of unique, so they're closer to my demographic, so what they do sort of counts for like 2 people, right? 2 of other kinds of people, because I have lots of this kind of person, like say, experienced people, right? I have lots of really experienced people, I have very few novice users, right? So the one novice user, the truly novice user I have, I'm going to count their like actions for like 5 times the weight of one of my many experienced users, because my real demographic is going to be more of an even mix between experienced users and novice users, for example. So you can try and control this to some extent with statistical weighting. Okay, so you try and get it as close as you can, and then if it's not quite close enough, then you can use statistics. Okay, so now you bring a user in, and the first thing that you should do is pay them before they even do the study. A lot of users are there just to get paid, okay? And so you don't want their responses in the study to be contingent on whether they get paid or not, okay? So if they really don't like the study and they want to leave, that's fine. It's probably bad data anyway. It's better to just let them go, right? And so, yeah, you should pay them up front, and it's not contingent on anything in the study, okay? If they like your system or hate your system, they get paid the same amount of money, right, obviously. But whether they complete the study or not, that's another thing where they get paid. All right, so after all that, we're ready to do the actual study. Okay, so just some general advice if you ever find yourself having to do this. You spend a lot of time designing the study you know, so that it's very smooth. You know exactly what you're doing. You make sure that everything fits within the 30-minute window that you have. Oftentimes, people might do a pilot study where they might try it out on their friends first, and then they tweak it, and then they might run 10 participants through, see how it's working, tweak it before they go out and they get 50 or 100 participants. So you, yeah. So that's called piloting the study, where you try it first. Now, what you actually do in the study is going to depend on what it is that you're measuring and what the system is itself. So I'll talk about one specific study that tends to come up a lot, which is that you have, like, say, an old version of, say, it's software. So you have an old version, you have some improvements, and you want to know whether those improvements are working the way that you want, okay? So inherently, this is what we call a comparative study, because you're comparing the old system, call it A, to the new system B, okay? Now, not every study is a comparison between two. Sometimes you just bring them in to use one system. There's no other system to test it against, okay? But when you're comparing two systems, it's a little easier because you're measuring the difference between two things, which is easier to put your finger on rather than, like, to give you an example, let's say that you want to know, is the software fast to use? Like, there's some task and you want to know how fast it is, right? If you just have one system and you measure it and it takes people 30 seconds, is 30 seconds a good number or a bad number, right? Is that fast or is that slow? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know, maybe it's fast, maybe it's slow, right? But if you do a comparative study where you're like, well, it's taking them 30 seconds on system A and it takes them 20 seconds on system B, now you know that, oh, that's faster, right? It's comparative, right? You're saving 10 seconds or, you know, as a percentage, you know, 33% or whatever. And so anyway, so comparative studies they're easier to make progress on. They're easier to prove things about rather than just studying one system itself. Okay. So it's generally between two or more systems. So sometimes we call them A and B. And so it could be that A is the old system, B is the new system. Or sometimes you have one system, but you, like, say you want to set the defaults, right? So you give them the system with one set of defaults, you give them the system with a different set of defaults and see how it works, or a different configuration. So it could be old, new, configuration 1, configuration 2. Okay, now there's two ways of doing a user study. Well, there's probably more than two, but there's two common ways of doing it. You have system A, you have system B, and you want to know the differences between them, okay? The most efficient use of your time is you bring a user in, you have them use system A, right? You do all your measurements, then you have them use system B, and you do all the measurements. Okay, but there's a big problem with that. The problem is that if system B is similar to system A, the fact that you got them to use system A first they get familiar with at least the general idea of that system, right? And so they're probably going to perform better the second time when they're using system B, even though it's a slightly different system, because they learned something from doing it the first time with system A, okay? And so what's much better to do is take your participants, split them in half, and half of your users are only going to use system A. They will never see system B. The other half are only going to use system B, and they will never see system A, okay? And that eliminates this learnability effect. So that type of design is called between subjects, and it's sort of the gold standard for a comparative study. The problem is that you need, if you want to run 10 people through system A and 10 people through system B, you need 20 people, right? Whereas if you had them each use both, then you only need 10 people. And then if you have 5 options, right, and you want 10 people for each group, then now you need 50 people, right? And so that's why you wouldn't want to do it, is just in terms of saving your time and the cost of doing the user study. Now, another important thing is that when you split your users into groups A and B, you want to do it randomly, okay? If you choose them, you know, the chances are, like, say you put all the novice users in group A and all the expert users in group B, then obviously that's going to skew the results, okay? So the easiest way to do it is just do it randomly. Sometimes people will tweak it slightly, so they'll say, well, you know, I only have 2 true novice users, and so I need to get 1 in system A and 1 in system B, otherwise I'm just not going to get meaningful data. So sometimes people play with it a little bit. So I put kind of random star, meaning, like, you know, sometimes for statistical reasons you might tweak it a bit, but you have to be careful. You know, why are you tweaking and what impact will that have on your results? And the best thing is just get large numbers, and then randomness will take care of evening out any differences between 2 groups. Okay, so now you do your user study, whatever. You have all your measurements. Now you want to do some analysis of what the results are, okay? So you want to say something about the usability, say, of A versus B, and so you have to turn your results into something concrete that you can say about it, okay? So the methodology here is involved, and you know, there's lots of statistics and stuff that are involved. So I'm just going to give you the high-level sketch of the idea. But the way that you do it is, first off, you start with what's called a hypothesis. So you say, okay, this is what I'm measuring, okay? System A is faster to use than system B. That's the hypothesis, okay? Now, it doesn't matter. The hypothesis isn't necessarily like you're supposed to guess correctly what the outcome will be. If it turns out that B is faster than A, then that's fine. You're going to disprove your hypothesis in the opposite direction. That's just as meaningful. And so you don't have to worry about, you know, getting your hypothesis right, okay? But it's just about writing down what exactly it is that you're measuring between the 2. And so you formalize that into a statement, which is a hypothesis. And then you want to prove or disprove your hypothesis. Okay, and generally you're going to try and do this numerically. And so, whether you prove it, whether the hypothesis is true or not, it's not just like, oh, I feel like it wasn't true. Yeah, I talked to 10 people and I kind of feel like maybe, system A is better than system B. No, like you have to make it concrete somehow, okay? And so ideally you're going to do this statistically. And what does it mean to prove or disprove a hypothesis statistically? It means that the numbers that you're seeing are unlikely to be due to just pure chance, okay? There's always the chance that, group B will be better than group A, just because you happen to put faster people in group B than group A, okay? But there's a certain probability that that will happen, okay? And the bigger your groups get, the smaller that probability is that it's, just by chance. And the more things that you measure, or if you try and measure it in 3 or 4 different ways, if they're all consistent with each other, then that seems to be indicating that there's a real difference as opposed to it being chance, right? Because if it's just chance, then group A will be better than group B for one task, but then group B will be better than group A for a different task, right? And so anyways, there's different tricks that you can play, but basically what you want to say is that, unlikely that the evidence you're seeing, or the results of your study, are due to chance. Okay, now what are you actually measuring? So sometimes you're measuring things that are quantitative, meaning like it's a number, right? So like how long does it, I'm going to start a timer, I'm going to measure how long it takes you to do a task. I get a number at the end of the day, and I run 100 users, I have 100 numbers here, I run 100 users on group B, I have 100 numbers here. It's easy, like relatively speaking, you can compute statistics on them, they're already numbers, okay? Now, what if I care about, do you like system A better than system B? Okay, that's not a number. I can't start my stopwatch and measure it, okay? So I have a bunch of feelings, about system A and a bunch of feelings about system B, but I want to say statistically, people feel differently about system A than they feel about system B. So in that case, I have qualitative data, okay? Things that aren't numeric. Okay, so let's say you want to do your study and you actually care about the qualitative stuff. Okay, there is some quantitative stuff, that's fine, you take it, you're able to do it. But what you really care about is the qualitative stuff. What do? How do you turn feelings into numbers?
Define some parameters.
Okay, so define parameters rating. What do you mean by parameters?
Like how likely would you use this software?
Okay, so you can try and, that's still not numbers though, right? Yeah, okay, let's go back though to what do you mean?
Well, for each feeling and interest, you just put like from 1 to 10 how satisfied, for example, are you, or like how good about yourself this systems make you feel.
Okay, great. So actually that's exactly the right answer, okay? So all of us have done this thing of making qualitative data quantitative, okay? And it always looks the same, right? You get some questionnaire and there's some grid with a bunch of dots like this. and you're like, here's a statement. Do you strongly agree? You know, somewhat agree, neutral, strongly, or somewhat disagree, strongly disagree, right? We've all seen this before, right? Okay, so why do you always see that everywhere? It's because it solves this problem, right? Now you have a number, right? And so I can have 100 people and I can say, well, the average response, you know, if I put 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 across here, I can say, well, the average response is 3.5 in these 100 people and it's 3.7 in these. So there's some difference between the two of them, okay? So this is famous. It even has a name. It's called the Lacquer Scale. Actually, no C. And there's some best practices with using lacquered scales. You might have done this before where you've had to like fill out 100, you know, questions or something with these lacquered scales, right? And so you know that after a while you get tired of doing it, right? So you want to keep it short. You want to avoid fatigue. You'll probably find that the first couple answers, people spend a lot of time. They think about it, right? By the time you get to the 98th, 99th, you're not really thinking about it anymore, okay? So you're going to get good quality about what you ask first. You might not get good quality data about what you're asking last. How do you fix that? Okay, so you shuffle the order, basically. The best thing is actually just randomize the order across all the questionnaires, okay? So everyone gets a questionnaire and the numbers are completely random. And then once again, randomness will take care of the fact that certain questions will appear early in some studies and later in other studies. Okay, if people get really bored and they really hate your Lacquer Scale questions, what are they going to do?
Exit.
So say it loud, everyone said it at the same time.
Either exit or just click randomly.
Okay, so they might, they could just stop answering, right? They could answer randomly. That actually takes a lot of cognitive load. What's easier than even answering randomly? Okay, I agree, or strongly agree all the way down. Okay? Now, what's this? Is there a way that you could stop that? Okay, you know users are going to do it. They're going to reach that. At least some users in your study are going to do that. They're going to do the I agree or strongly agree all the way down, right? Is there anything that you can do about that, or do you just have to live with that reality? It's still going to skew the data though, right?
Repeat the same question again so that if you answer the same, you know that.
Okay, so you can ask the same question more than once. And an added thing is you can flip the question around. So you can say, hey, do you like system A better than B? Strongly agree. And then later you ask, do you like system B better than system A? Right? And if they say strongly agree to that as well, then that's inconsistent, right? So, yeah. So you can do these consistency checks. So you basically, you ask the same question more than once, and you try and flip it around so that you can see whether they're answering consistently, and that's like a proxy for how much attention they're paying. So you can invert the question. So that's what I mean is that you would flip it around so that And then you can run some statistics to see how consistent a person is, and then you might weight them higher or lower depending, or even discard if their consistency is off. Okay, so speaking of statistical tests, so now you have numbers. Okay, so either you have your quantitative numbers or you have your qualitative feelings that you've converted into numbers by using a Lacquer Scale, and you did all these best practices, so you have good quality numbers. Okay. Now what you want to do is you want to do some statistical test, which is going to help you prove or disprove your hypothesis. Okay. I won't go into the details of the statistic tests, A, because I don't know them myself. I'm not a statistician, and secondly, I know that they're complicated, and when people write papers, like they really need to know what they're talking and why are you doing that exact test instead of this test and all of that. So this is something that is best left to experts, but I can tell you a bit about sort of high-level principles about them. So first off, it requires expertise to make sure you're using the right tests. Okay, so if you're doing a comparative study, you're looking for differences in the numbers between group A and group B. Or C, it doesn't have to be binary, but it's the simplest case. Okay, and ideally what you want to say is that I see a difference, and the difference is what we call significant, statistically significant. Okay, so that's what you want. And statistical significance just basically means it's unlikely. And you can specify how unlikely. Like, is it, 99% unlikely? Is it 95%? Whatever. You can. There's different numbers that you can put in, but it's unlikely due to chance. Okay, so you have a hypothesis. There's a difference between group A and B. That's my hypothesis. I run the numbers, and I either get, yes, there is a difference, like A is different than B, or B is different than A, or I get, I don't know, right? That's another answer. The numbers are too close that maybe there's a difference there, maybe there isn't, you can't conclude. Okay, so that means when you can't prove statistical significance. And sometimes people will say, hey, I tried, I got close to statistical significance, but it just wasn't quite significant. So maybe we should do a follow-up study to try it again. Like it's not like it's completely disproven or something like that. Like it's still a question mark. But generally, yeah, you're looking for that statistical significance. Okay. Now, let's say that you do your numbers and it's not statistically significant, okay? And you're not ready to give up. What can you do to fix that? Is there anything you can do to try and get statistical significance? So you can always run more users, okay? So you're trying to measure the difference between two groups. The number of users that you run is going to, like, say it's a subtle difference, then just the random composition of the two groups might sort of mask that difference, okay? If you get more and more users, then you can measure things that are more subtle between the two groups and know that they're not due to chance alone, okay? In other words, you're comparing to, like, in world A, you're seeing some difference because of chance, and in world B, you're seeing some difference because it's actually there, okay? Chance is very sensitive to, like, low numbers, right? If you take the average across people, the bigger the set of people you have, the more accurate that average gets, right? The closer and closer you get to the true average, okay? So increasing your numbers allows you to measure subtler effects, okay? Now, let's say that it actually is due to chance, okay? Then when you run more numbers, the differences disappear, okay? So running more participants always helps you, right? It either, it makes the difference more pronounced, or if there is no actual difference there, then it makes the difference disappear. And so ideally you would want to run as many participants as you can, okay? But the constraint is it's time and money, right? And so you don't want to, you don't want to run, 2,000 people through your user study you're doing in person that takes half an hour because it's just logistically too hard, okay? So you want to sort of strike that balance and try and find enough participants so that it's statistically significant, but not too many that you're wasting a lot of time and money on it. So a general kind of rough estimate is it's obviously going to depend on how subtle the effect is that you're measuring, okay? If it's a subtle effect, you're going to need more users to distinguish it from chance. If it's something that's very obvious, right, there's an obvious difference between the two, then you don't have to run as many users in order to notice the difference and see that it's significant. So just to give you rough numbers, if you have a strong sort of difference between the two groups, then something like 20 users could be enough. So if there's a real strong difference, and then if it's more subtle, it would be more like on the order of 200 participants. So when I read security usability papers, I see a lot that use around 20. And then a good study might use like 40 or something like that. I don't think I've ever seen one other than if it was an online study that was fully automated or some sort of field test. Usually you're not going to bring 200 people in. So like 200 people would be like the best user study ever, kind of, for this setting. So yeah, so it's usually somewhere between these two. So if 200 isn't enough, then it's probably so subtle that it's going to be hard to prove. And yeah, 20, it's realistic that 20 might not be enough, okay? You might start to notice that there's a trend in the difference between the numbers, but you just can't prove, you can't prove it. Okay, so that's the user study. There's one other thing I was going to tell you. I'm going to back up because I forgot to mention it. And we have 5 minutes left. Where is it? Oh yeah, I was going to tell you a little story that has nothing to do with security about fatigue. Okay, so this story, yeah, has nothing to do with security, but it illustrates this point, I think, really well. So back in, I guess it was when I was a kid. Okay, so everyone knows the software drink Coke, right, and Pepsi. And so what Coke and Pepsi decided to do, actually Pepsi decided to do, is they were trying to market Pepsi, and so they came up with this thing called the Pepsi Test, or the Pepsi Challenge. So they would go into like grocery stores and supermarkets, and they would set up a booth, and they would give you a sample of Coke and a sample of Pepsi, but they wouldn't tell you which is which, okay? And then you would drink one of each, and then they would ask you, which one do you like better? And people invariably said Pepsi, okay? People like Pepsi better. This is why Pepsi was doing this. And the reason is because Pepsi's sweeter. Basically, that's what it comes down to, okay? So when you taste the two side by side, Pepsi just tastes better, it's sweeter. And so Coke was getting annihilated in the market because Pepsi was doing this. So then Coke said, okay, well, we need to respond. We need to do something. And so they said, well, let's come up with a new version of Coke, okay? So they went to the lab, and they started doing these tests themselves, and they started playing around with the formula of Coke, okay? And their idea was they're going to play around with it until they found a version of Coke that would win in a Pepsi challenge with Pepsi, okay? So eventually they did it. They rolled it out. They called it Coke as opposed to Coca-Cola. It's also called New Coke if you want to read the Wikipedia article or whatever on it. And so they went to the supermarket, they had this new Coke, and then they did the same stunt. They set up the tables and they said, okay, we have this new drink. And sure enough, users drank it, and they drank a little bit of the new Coke, and they drank a little bit of Pepsi, and they liked the new Coke better. The new Coke was even sweeter than Pepsi. It had like kind of a lemon, like kind of subtle hints of lemon to it. Okay. Now there was a problem. Okay. Here's the problem. The problem is you would go to the supermarket and you would do the tests, and you'd say, oh yeah, I like this new Coke better. Okay. And so you would buy it. Then you would get home and you would actually start drinking an entire can of it. And then you might drink 2 or 3 cans of it. And all of a sudden you realize that the things that make it taste better because it's a small sample don't taste so good when you drink an entire can, right? It's kind of syrupy and it's overly sweet. And the first sip tastes good, but it gets kind of gross after a while. And so the product flopped. Everyone hated it. And then people were mad because they couldn't buy the original Coca-Cola. And so eventually Coke, they had to reverse it, and they actually like pulled it off of the shelves and they reinstated the original Coca-Cola. Okay. So the lesson here is, it's actually maybe a little different than what I'd said, but if you get users to test something in a small sample, their response could be completely different than if you get them to use it for months and months and months. Okay. Another case in point is Microsoft Word. They once decided that they want to help users use their product. So they had this like animated clip art of a paper clip, and it would like sit in the corner, and it would like kind of bounce around, and it would be like, hey, do you want me to teach you how to make something bold? Or do you want me to teach you this, right? And so that's something that performs really well in user studies, because users use it for 20 minutes and they're like, yeah, I do want to know how to make something bold. It's really cool that you're telling me that, right? But when you use Word for 50 hours and it's your job, you get really annoyed with that thing, right? And you hate it and you want it to go away, okay? So a user study, it's another con of a user study, is that you are measuring people's like small samples of things as opposed to like a longer duration. Yes?
But doesn't Coke and Pepsi work for the same company?
No, they're different companies.
No, they're the same.
No, they're different. They're competitors. But Coke owns Sprite and Pepsi owns 7-Up, and all of them have like a whole bunch of drinks that are under them. Anyways, okay, so that's it. Yeah, last question.
When they were doing this testing, like, for example, when Coke was conducting that test, Pepsi was aware that they are using Pepsi as a sample?
Yeah, so that's fine. I mean, you can do that. They're not showing the logo or anything like that. They're just saying, this is our competitor.
All neutral.
Our competitor, yeah. Okay, that's it, and I'll see you all next week.